picture this. You uncover a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme at your company, but instead of praise, your new boss fires you to keep it hidden. Betrayed and silenced. One accountant fights back, risking everything to expose a corporate conspiracy. When your secretary starts avoiding eye contact, you know something's off. My name is Michael Carter, 42 years old, senior accountant at Sky Peak Tech in Denver, Colorado, where I'd been making numbers behave for almost a decade. Not the most glamorous job, but it kept my mind sharp and my daughter in college. That morning, Lisa, who'd always greeted me with a smile and my coffee already on my desk, busied herself with filing when I walked in. Didn't look up. Didn't say good morning, just shuffled papers like I wasn't there. Something had shifted. I felt it in the air of the office conversation stopping when I approached meeting invites that suddenly excluded me, and most concerning, my access to certain financial folders on the server had been quietly revoked 2 days prior. I sat at my desk, opened my spreadsheets, and started reviewing the quarterly reports I'd been working on before Ethan Brooks arrived, new chief financial officer brought in after our longtime CFO, Richard, had a heart attack and took early retirement. Ethan came with impressive credentials from some East Coast firm and the kind of confidence that fills a room and empties it of questions. The numbers weren't adding up. I'd found it 3 weeks earlier, vendor payments without proper documentation, revenue recognized months before the contracts were fulfilled, and a mysterious account that seemed to hold millions that appeared and disappeared between reporting periods. The first time I brought it up in the finance meeting, Ethan had smiled, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Different methods from your old ways. Michael, trust the process." The second time I'd emailed him directly with specific examples, spreadsheets highlighted inconsistencies. No response. The third time yesterday I'd caught him alone in the break room. "I need to discuss these discrepancies," I said, keeping my voice low. "The Q2 reporting is showing—" Michael, he'd cut me off, stirring his coffee slowly. "You're the old guard here. I respect that, but we're modernizing our approach. Board wants growth metrics. Think big picture." I hadn't slept well after that. 20 years in accounting had taught me that when someone tells you to ignore the details and think big picture about financial reporting, something's usually wrong. As I scrolled through the latest files, I still had access to an email notification appeared in the corner of my screen from Human Resources, subject meeting request, 11:00 a.m. today. I closed my laptop, took a sip of the coffee I'd bought myself on the way in, and started organizing my desk. I already knew what was coming. I joined Sky Peak back when we were just 30 people in a refurbished warehouse before we went public before the Denver tech boom. Now we had 300 employees, a gleaming downtown office, and institutional investors who expected consistent growth every quarter. My wife Sarah used to joke that I was married to my spreadsheets. "You see stories in numbers," she'd say. Not wrong. I could spot patterns, inconsistencies, the places where human nature leaked into supposedly objective data. That attention to detail had earned me Richard's trust. He'd called me his detector. Companies need at least one person who can't be charmed or intimidated out of seeing what's there. He'd told me over beers after we'd caught an attempt by the sales team to book revenue that hadn't actually closed. I thought about my brother-in-law, David, Sarah's younger brother, who'd gone the government route instead of private sector. He worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission in their enforcement division. We weren't particularly close, but we respected each other, had decent conversations at family gatherings about regulatory issues and financial enforcement cases in the news. Last Christmas, while everyone else was watching football, we'd ended up talking on the back porch about a corporate fraud case that had made headlines. By the time we get involved, it's usually been happening for months, sometimes years. David had said most frauds get caught, because someone on the inside realizes what's happening and speaks up. Whistleblowers, I'd said. Just people with a conscience and eyes to see, he'd corrected. The ones who can't pretend they don't notice. The memory faded as I checked my watch. 10:45. Almost time for my meeting with HR. Looking back, I should have seen this coming earlier. The signs were all there. Ethan had been systematically cutting me out since his third week. Questions I raised in meetings were dismissed. My team slowly reassigned to other projects. My reports increasingly simplified or buried. Then last week, I'd found it, the smoking gun. Reviewing some historical data, I noticed a pattern of revenue manipulation that spanned the last 2 quarters. Millions of dollars shifted between subsidiaries, false sales, recorded backdated contracts, not subtle, if you knew where to look, but catastrophic. If it continued, I documented everything meticulously made, copies stored them securely just in case my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How's your day going?" I didn't reply better to tell her in person tonight. I closed the company financial report I'd been reviewing, locked my computer, and headed to the HR conference room. Time to face whatever came next. "We're restructuring the finance department," said Ethan, seated next to Emily from HR. "Unfortunately, your position has been eliminated." I nodded, face expressionless. This wasn't a surprise, but the careful wording was almost amusing. Not fired, eliminated, like I was a budget line item being crossed out. "Your institutional knowledge has been valuable," Ethan continued. "But we're moving toward more automated systems, more forward-looking analytics." "I see," I said. Emily slid a folder across the table. "This contains information about your severance package, continuation of benefits, and an NDA. We'll need you to sign." I opened it. Scanned the first page, 6 months' salary. Decent. The non-disclosure agreement was extensive, specifically prohibiting me from discussing Skypeak's financial processes, reporting methods, or proprietary business practices with anyone. "Take your time reading it," Emily said. "We don't need an answer today." "And of course," Ethan added with a tight smile, "we'd appreciate discretion about our conversation here for the sake of team morale." I closed the folder. "I'll need to review this with my lawyer." Something flickered across Ethan's face. Annoyance, maybe concern. He hadn't expected pushback, not even this mild. "Of course," Emily interjected smoothly. "Standard procedure. In the meantime, we'll need to begin the off-boarding process today." 30 minutes later, I was escorted to my desk by security. A cardboard box for personal items. Email access already disabled. Building access card collected. A few colleagues watched from their desks, expressions ranging from embarrassment to relief. It wasn't them. As I packed my family photos and the ceramic mug my daughter had made in middle school, Lisa finally met my eyes. "I'm sorry, Michael," she whispered. "This isn't right." I just nodded. Not her fault. Ryan from my team passed by, hesitated, then stopped to help me pack. "They've reassigned all your reports to the new team from Boston," he muttered, pretending to organize papers. "Nobody's explaining the methodology changes." I slipped him my personal email address on a sticky note. "If you have questions later." Security cleared his throat. Time to go. Walking through the lobby with my box, past the gleaming sign with the company logo I'd helped build, something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly. Something colder, clearer. For weeks I'd been wrestling with doubt, wondering if I was misinterpreting the numbers, if I was just resistant to change. Now I knew they wouldn't fire a senior accountant over modernization. They'd fire someone who saw too much. In my car, I sat for a moment, hands on the wheel. I didn't slam the dashboard or curse. Instead, I pulled out my phone and looked at the flash drive tucked in my wallet, the one containing copies of everything I'd documented. Then I scrolled to David's contact information. My brother-in-law at the SEC, I hadn't called him in months, hadn't really wanted to mix family and work. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about investors being lied to, regulations, being broken, a company I'd helped build, being hollowed out from the inside. I pressed call. "David, it's Michael. I think we need to talk. They want you to sign this." David slid the severance agreement back across my kitchen table, his expression grim in the evening light. "This NDA is exceptionally broad." Sarah poured more coffee, her movements sharp with anger. After hearing what happened, she'd immediately called her brother. He'd driven over straight from his office. "6 months' salary is generous," I said, "but they're buying silence and they know exactly what you've seen." David said he was thinner than I remembered his government job, apparently not allowing much time for regular meals. Otherwise, they wouldn't offer this much. I handed him the flash drive. "Everything I found is here, revenue manipulation across 2 quarters, at least phantom transactions moving money between subsidiaries to inflate growth numbers." David pocketed it, but shook his head. "This is definitely concerning. But I need to be clear, if you sign that NDA and then share this information, they could sue you personally. The SEC could still investigate, but you'd be legally exposed." "So they get away with it?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. "Not necessarily." David ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Michael hasn't signed anything yet, but we need to be careful about next steps." The following morning, I contacted a lawyer specializing in employment issues. Laura Mitchell listened carefully to my situation, reviewed the severance agreement, and confirmed what David had suggested. This NDA would effectively prevent you from acting as a whistleblower. She said I'd advise against signing it as written. "Can we negotiate better terms?" She smiled thinly. "We can try." 2 days later, I received a call from Ethan himself. Not HR, his voice was tight. "Michael, I understand you've engaged legal counsel to review the agreement. Standard procedure." I echoed his earlier words, a pause. "We value your years of service and want this transition to be smooth for everyone. Perhaps we can meet to discuss your concerns." That afternoon, I found myself back in the same conference room, this time with Laura beside me, facing Ethan and the company's general counsel, a stern woman named Rachel. "We can increase the severance to 9 months, Ethan offered, but the confidentiality provisions remain non-negotiable." Laura smiled politely. "My client has concerns about certain financial irregularities he observed during his employment. The current language could be interpreted as preventing him from fulfilling his legal obligations if regulatory issues arise." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting Mr. Carter intends to make allegations against Sky Peak?" "I'm suggesting?" Laura replied that my client can't waive his legal right to report potentially unlawful activity regardless of any agreement. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I think we need to be very clear," Ethan said, leaning forward. "There are no irregularities or unlawful activities at Sky Peak. What there is a former employee who perhaps misunderstood our updated accounting practices and might be harboring resentment over organizational changes." He slid a new document across the table. "We are prepared to offer 12 months' salary. Quite generous, but we'll need a signed statement confirming you observed no illegal activities during your employment, along with the NDA." I felt Laura stiffen beside me. "We'll need to review this new offer," she said, gathering her papers. In the elevator down, she was blunt. "They're scared. That counteroffer is basically asking you to sign a false statement which would discredit you if you ever came forward later." I realized exactly. And 12 months' salary is a small price for them to pay to neutralize a potential whistleblower. As we walked through the lobby, I noticed Ryan from my team hurrying in through the main entrance. When he saw me, his eyes widened. He veered toward the coffee shop embedded in the building instead of the elevators. I told Laura I'd meet her at the car. Michael Ryan said quietly when I approached him in line, "They're going through all your old files. Ethan has a team working late, modifying reports you worked on." My stomach dropped. "They're covering their tracks." He nodded, pale. "And they just announced an all-hands tomorrow about exciting Q3 projections. The numbers they're showing..." He shook his head. "They're not real. Be careful, Michael. They're saying things about you that you couldn't adapt, that you made mistakes." He grabbed his coffee and left quickly. I walked to Laura's car, my mind racing. They weren't just hiding past fraud, they were accelerating it, emboldened by my removal. That night, David came over again. We spread printouts across my dining room table, documents I'd taken, analyses. He'd begun regulations potentially violated. "This goes deeper than I initially thought," he said, tapping a particular spreadsheet. "These patterns suggest the manipulation started before Ethan arrived." I frowned, reviewing the timeline. That doesn't make sense. Richard was meticulous, ethical to a fault. When did Richard leave exactly? 4 months ago. Sudden heart attack. He'd been stressed working late, but something clicked. I pulled up a different document. The audit committee meeting, minutes from my files. Richard had raised concerns about pressure from the board to improve quarterly numbers just 2 weeks before his health crisis. "You think he was pushed out?" Sarah asked, setting down 3 beers. "Not necessarily pushed," I said slowly. "But if he was under pressure to manipulate results and refused..." "The stress alone could trigger health issues," David finished, "and create an opening to bring in someone more flexible." I took a long drink. So Ethan was hired specifically to continue or cover up fraud that was already happening. "It's a theory," David cautioned. "But look at the board changes last year. 3 new directors from investment firms that specialize in tech turnarounds. They probably wanted faster growth to position for acquisition. I sorted through more documents, finding board meeting minutes. Here, they approved an executive compensation plan heavily weighted toward stock performance metrics. The entire C-suite gets massive bonuses if the share price hits certain targets." David nodded grimly. "Classic motivation. And with Richard gone, you were the last person in finance who might notice and object. For hours, we pieced together the larger picture. This wasn't just Ethan, it was systematic, involving board members, possibly other executives. The scope was staggering: inflated revenues, hidden expenses, manipulated projections designed to artificially boost the stock price ahead of a rumored acquisition. The public filing next week, I realized. If they report these falsified Q3 numbers, they're committing securities fraud in broad daylight and potentially harming thousands of investors." David added. Around midnight, Catherine called with news. Sky Peak's counsel reached out. They're withdrawing the severance offer, entirely claiming evidence of potential misconduct on your part. My laugh was hollow. "What misconduct?" "They're alleging you took confidential documents, and they're threatening to pursue all available remedies unless you return all company property immediately." "They know," Sarah said after I hung up. "They know you have evidence, which means we've hit a nerve." David gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Michael, this has escalated beyond a wrongful termination. The SEC needs to open a formal investigation." "What does that mean for me?" "You'd become an official whistleblower. There are protections, but it's still a difficult road. These cases can take years. The company will likely attack your credibility, your work history, anything they can find." Sarah took my hand. "Can they hurt him legally? If everything you've shown me is accurate, you've done nothing wrong. But corporate defendants have resources, lawyers, and motivation to fight dirty." I thought about Sky Peak, the company I'd helped build from its early days, about Richard, who might have been pressured into a health crisis for maintaining his ethics about Ryan and others, still they're being forced to participate in fraud or risk their livelihoods. I'll need to think about this, I said. David nodded, understanding. The protection of whistleblowers is strongest when they act before they're terminated or targeted. The timing here isn't ideal, but the evidence is compelling. After he left, Sarah and I sat in silence for a while. I could just walk away. I finally said, "Find another job. Let someone else deal with it." She studied my face. Could you really sleep at night knowing what you know? I already knew the answer. I'd never been able to ignore problems in front of me, to pretend numbers added up when they didn't. It was both my greatest strength and what had cost me my job. No, I admitted I couldn't. The SEC moved faster than I expected. Once David officially brought the case to his supervisors, things accelerated rapidly. I spent 2 days in closed-door meetings at the SEC offices, walking investigators through everything I'd found. They were particularly interested in the timeline, how the manipulation had evolved, how Ethan had systematically excluded me from financial oversight, the connection to executive compensation tied to stock performance. "The company's Q3 filing is scheduled for Monday," said Susan Chen, the lead investigator. "Based on what you've provided, we have grounds to act before. Then you can stop the filing." I asked. "Better?" she replied. "We can catch them in the act." What followed was a carefully choreographed plan. The SEC would not alert Sky Peak about the investigation yet. Instead, they'd monitor the final preparation of the fraudulent filing. They needed to catch the executives knowingly submitting false financial statements. My role was to stay completely silent. No contact with former colleagues, no social media, nothing that might tip them off. Meanwhile, Laura filed a wrongful termination claim, creating a distraction. Sky Peak's legal team would focus on fighting that battle while unaware of the larger investigation building behind the scenes. On Friday, 3 days before the scheduled filing, Ryan texted me from a new number. CFO called emergency Saturday meeting for finance team. Final review before Monday filing. They're rushing it. I forwarded this to David without responding to Ryan. We couldn't risk any leaks. Saturday morning brought unexpected news. David called at dawn. "Richard's agreed to talk," he said, excitement breaking through his professional demeanor. Richard, my old boss. "We approached him confidentially yesterday. He initially refused, but after hearing the scope of what we've uncovered, he changed his mind." This was the breakthrough we needed. Richard had been there before. During and immediately after the fraud began, he could testify to the pressure he'd received, identify who had pushed for the accounting manipulations, and validate my findings. By Saturday afternoon, Richard had provided a sworn statement to the SEC. The pieces were falling into place faster than any of us had anticipated. Sunday night, I barely slept. The filing was scheduled for 8:00 a.m. Monday. Sarah found me at the kitchen table at 5:00 a.m., staring at my phone. "Whatever happens," she said, squeezing my shoulder, "you did the right thing." David texted at 6:30 a.m., "Teams in position. Stay by your phone." At 7:15 a.m., "Filing drafted and approved internally. We have copies." At 8:02 a.m., "Filing submitted to SEC green light." At 8:45 a.m., financial news channels began reporting breaking news. SEC enforcement officials had entered Sky Peak Tech headquarters with subpoenas and warrants. By 9:30 a.m., trading of Sky Peak stock was halted. At 10:15 a.m., camera crews captured Ethan Brooks being escorted from the building, along with the CEO and 2 other executives David called at noon. "It's done," They filed the fraudulent statements this morning, despite having been warned by Richard months ago about the accounting issues. We have emails proving they knew the numbers were false, and we found evidence they were planning to announce an acquisition next week, timed perfectly to cash in their stock options at the inflated price. I felt oddly hollow watching the news coverage. The company I'd given a decade to was now a breaking scandal. Former colleagues would face uncertainty. The stock would plummet, reputations would be destroyed. Was there any other way this could have ended? I asked David. No, he said firmly. The fraud would have continued until it collapsed under its own weight and hurt far more people in the process. My phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. It was Ryan. They're saying you were right all along about everything. I didn't reply. I didn't need validation anymore. The numbers had spoken for themselves. 4 months after that Monday morning raid, I sat in a federal courthouse listening as Ethan Brooks pleaded guilty to securities fraud conspiracy and making false statements to investors. The CEO and 2 board members had already entered similar pleas. I wasn't a witness. The evidence had been so overwhelming that the case never went to trial. Richard sat beside me, still looking frail, but with clear eyes. I should have fought harder, he said quietly as Ethan was led away. Instead, I let them push me out. When my heart gave warning signs, you did fight, I reminded him. You documented everything which helped build the case. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. The defendants exploited their positions of trust, manipulated financial statements, and deliberately misled investors for personal gain. This court takes a particularly dim view of executives who pressure subordinates to participate in fraudulent schemes and then terminate those who refuse to comply. Afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, a reporter recognized me. Mr. Carter, you were the whistleblower who exposed the Sky Peak fraud. Any comment on today's guilty pleas? I shook my head and kept walking. This wasn't about publicity or vindication. That evening, I received an email from Sky Peak's new interim CEO, a respected financial restructuring specialist brought in by the board's remaining members. The board would like to extend a formal apology for your termination and the subsequent attempts to discredit you. Your commitment to financial integrity ultimately saved this company from even greater harm. We would welcome a conversation about your potential return in a senior oversight capacity as we rebuild trust with investors and employees. I showed the email to Sarah. Are you considering it? She asked. I closed the laptop. No. Some bridges once burned shouldn't be rebuilt. The company that had valued growth over ethics, that had punished truth-telling, and rewarded deception, wasn't one I wanted to help resurrect even under new management. 6 months after the courthouse, I sat on our back deck watching autumn leaves fall. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Final settlement announced $62 million penalty, defrauded investors getting 94 cents on the dollar. Not bad. I set the phone down and returned to the papers spread before me a business plan for a financial compliance consulting firm. After the Sky Peak case made headlines, I'd received calls from companies wanting to strengthen their internal controls, from law firms needing expert witnesses from business schools requesting guest lectures. Turned out there was a market for people who understood both the mechanics of financial fraud and the courage to stand against it. Richard's on the phone, Sarah called from inside, says he has news. Richard had been consulting with the Justice Department on strengthening whistleblower protections. His experience, both the health toll and the courage to eventually come forward, had made him an effective advocate. They're adopting our recommendations, he told me, voice stronger than I'd heard in years. New protections, better reward structure, clearer reporting channels should make it easier for the next person who spots something wrong. That's good, I said, meaning it. That's really good. After we hung up, I made a few final notes on my business plan. The whistleblower award I'd received had given us financial security, but this new venture wasn't about money. It was about making integrity the default, not the exception. Sarah brought out coffee sitting beside me. "You never did tell me," she said. "When exactly you knew you were going to report them, I thought about it. The moment they fired me, not because I was angry, but because that's when I knew for certain I was right. They wouldn't have gone to that trouble otherwise." She nodded. "Some people mistake being quiet for being weak. Their mistake," I said, watching another leaf drift down. "Not mine. This fight showed me that truth doesn't need a spotlight. It needs someone brave enough to stand by it. I lost my job, but gained a purpose, building a future where integrity wins. If this story hit you hard, share it. Let's talk about standing up for what's right. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you're here for more stories of grit and justice, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep the truth alive together."